Everything changed on a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen island trying to confirm our flight details for an upcoming family trip to Charleston. Lauren had booked everything weeks earlier, and she usually kept the confirmations on her tablet because she handled most of our travel plans. The house was quiet. Our kids were still at school. I had taken a late lunch between meetings and figured I'd double-check the departure time before booking airport parking. When I opened her tablet, I expected to see the airline website. Instead, a messaging app appeared. I immediately reached for the close button. I wasn't interested in reading my wife's conversations. Then a new message appeared before I could exit. Don't worry. Nobody suspects anything. I froze. The sender's name wasn't a friend. It wasn't a relative. It was Ethan Brooks. I knew exactly who he was. Ethan worked in Lauren's division. A younger manager she'd mentioned dozens of times over the previous year. His name came up during dinner conversations, conference calls, and company events. I had never paid much attention to it before. Now I stared at the screen. The message itself wasn't romantic. There were no hearts. No obvious declarations. Nothing that immediately proved anything. But something about it felt wrong. Nobody suspects anything. The words stayed in my head. I closed the app and set the tablet down exactly where I found it. For several minutes, I sat alone in the kitchen, looking through the window toward our backyard. I didn't know what I was looking at yet. I didn't know what was happening. But I knew one thing. My day wasn't going to end the way it started. Before that afternoon, I would have described our life as stable. Not exciting every day. Not perfect. Just steady in the way most people hope a marriage becomes after enough years together. Lauren and I had been married for 8 years. We lived outside Nashville, Tennessee, and spent most of our time juggling work schedules, school events, soccer practices, grocery lists, and everything else that comes with raising 2 children. Our routines were predictable. I handled most of the finances. Lauren managed calendars and travel plans. We divided responsibilities without really discussing them anymore, because we'd been doing it the same way for years. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. Even looking back now, I can't point to a single dramatic moment when everything changed. The shift happened gradually. About a year earlier, Lauren started talking more about work. She had recently been promoted to regional director for a logistics company, and the position came with more responsibility than her previous role. At first, I was proud of her. The longer hours made sense. The increased travel made sense. The constant phone calls made sense. There was always a reasonable explanation available. When dinner ran late because she was on a conference call, it was work. When she missed a school event because of a client meeting, it was work. When she flew to another city with little notice, it was work. I accepted every explanation because I had no reason not to. Trust isn't something you think about when it's present. You simply operate under the assumption that the person beside you is telling the truth. That was the version of our marriage I believed in. The version that existed right up until the moment I opened her tablet and saw a message that didn't fit the story I had been living. After seeing that message, I didn't suddenly become suspicious of everything. The change was quieter than that. For several days, I told myself there was probably an explanation I hadn't considered yet. Maybe the message referred to a project. Maybe it involved office politics. Maybe I was connecting dots that weren't actually connected. But once a question enters your mind, it's difficult to ignore. I started noticing details that previously would have passed by without leaving any impression. Most of them seemed insignificant on their own. Lauren mentioned Ethan Brooks constantly. Not every day, but often enough that his name began standing out whenever it appeared in conversation. Ethan handled that account. Ethan will be joining the meeting. Ethan's team is presenting next week. Individually, none of those comments meant anything. Together, they formed a pattern. As the weeks passed, I began paying closer attention to the stories she brought home from work. Certain employees seemed to receive opportunities others didn't. Projects were reassigned unexpectedly. Managers with more experience were occasionally bypassed for assignments that somehow ended up connected to Ethan's department. The more I listened, the more unusual it sounded. What bothered me wasn't favoritism itself. Every workplace has favorites. What bothered me was how frequently Ethan's name appeared whenever an important decision was involved. I found myself reviewing old conversations in my head. Meetings, business trips, promotions, special projects. Without realizing it, I had spent months hearing about the same person over and over again. At first, I assumed I was looking at a possible personal relationship. Then another possibility began to emerge. If Lauren and Ethan were involved somehow, the situation might extend beyond my marriage. It might also explain decisions being made inside her department. That was the first moment I considered that the real story could be much larger than I originally believed. I never confronted Lauren about the message. At least not immediately. The temptation was there. More than once, I found myself rehearsing questions during my drive home from work. Who sent it? What did it mean? What exactly was nobody supposed to suspect? But every version of that conversation ended the same way, with explanations. If something inappropriate was happening, confronting her before I understood the situation would only give her an opportunity to shape the narrative. So I stayed quiet. Not because I was afraid of the answer, because I wasn't ready to accept guesses. I wanted facts. The decision surprised even me. Normally, I'm the kind of person who addresses problems directly. If something breaks, you fix it. If something feels wrong, you talk about it. This was different. For the first time in our marriage, I realized I no longer trusted the information I was receiving. That recognition changed everything. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. Trust had always acted like a filter. Whenever something seemed unusual, I automatically searched for the most innocent explanation. A canceled dinner became a scheduling issue. A missed call became a busy afternoon. A changed plan became a misunderstanding. Once that filter disappeared, the same events looked completely different. I stopped trying to explain things away. I stopped convincing myself that every inconsistency had a harmless cause. Instead, I allowed myself to consider possibilities I had spent months avoiding. The strange schedules, the frequent travel, the repeated references to Ethan, the disappearing complaints I'd begun hearing about from people connected to her company. None of it proved anything. But for the first time, I wasn't actively defending the story I'd been told. I was simply observing it. And once I reached that point, something unexpected happened. The anxiety faded. In its place came clarity. I no longer felt responsible for protecting a version of reality that might not be true. My only responsibility was finding out what actually was. Once I stopped looking for explanations, I started paying attention to patterns. Not obsessively, not every hour of every day, just enough to compare what I was being told against what was actually happening. The first thing I noticed involved business travel. Lauren's calendar listed conferences in different cities throughout the year. At face value, everything appeared normal. But when I reviewed travel confirmations and expense records that passed through our joint accounts, certain details didn't line up. Ethan Brooks seemed to attend many of the same events. Again, that wasn't proof of anything. They worked in the same division. It would have been stranger if their schedules never overlapped. What bothered me was how often those overlaps occurred. Then I noticed discrepancies between conference schedules and hotel reservations. Some stays extended beyond official event dates. Some restaurant charges appeared miles away from conference venues. Others occurred during hours when company functions had supposedly ended. Individually, each detail could be explained. Together, they formed a picture I couldn't ignore. Then I discovered something I hadn't been looking for. A former employee had posted comments online about favoritism within Lauren's department months earlier. The allegations were vague, but they mentioned promotions, project assignments, and preferential treatment involving management decisions. Curious, I kept digging. Eventually, I learned that an internal complaint had been filed around the same time. Several employees had reportedly raised concerns about unfair advancement opportunities. What happened next surprised me. Nothing. The complaint seemed to disappear. No resolution. No public outcome. No visible disciplinary action. The issue simply vanished from discussion. That was the moment my focus shifted. Until then, I thought I might be uncovering problems inside my marriage. Now it appeared I might also be looking at something affecting an entire department. And if that was true, the consequences reached far beyond my front door. By that point, I was no longer looking at the situation solely as a husband. The evidence I had gathered raised questions that extended into Lauren's workplace. The more information I reviewed, the more difficult it became to separate personal decisions from professional ones. Employees had complained about favoritism. Project assignments appeared inconsistent. Promotions seemed to follow patterns that didn't always align with experience or performance. And somehow, Ethan Brooks remained connected to nearly every conversation. I still couldn't prove there was an affair. But I no longer believed that was the most important question. What concerned me was influence. If personal relationships were affecting management decisions, then people throughout the department were paying the price. Over several weeks, I quietly researched individuals who had previously worked under Lauren's leadership. Public information revealed a surprising amount. Some had left shortly after being passed over for promotions. Others had transferred to different divisions. A few had posted carefully worded comments about workplace culture, leadership concerns, and limited advancement opportunities. Nobody made direct accusations. Nobody openly named Lauren. Yet the themes repeated often enough to catch my attention. The pattern was difficult to ignore. One person loses an opportunity. Another employee resigns. A complaint disappears. A favored manager continues receiving assignments. Viewed separately, each event looked ordinary. Viewed together, they looked connected. What struck me most was the number of people affected. This wasn't simply a private matter between two adults. Career paths had been altered. Professional reputations had been influenced. Employees had invested years of effort into positions where decisions may not have been made fairly. For the first time, I stopped thinking about betrayal. Instead, I started thinking about consequences. Because if my suspicions were correct, the relationship itself wasn't the entire problem. It was merely the center point from which every other problem seemed to spread. And eventually, situations like that stop hiding themselves. They become too large to contain. Lauren wasn't expecting the divorce papers. When she was served, she called me 3 times before I answered. By the time she arrived home that evening, she was furious. The front door closed harder than usual, and I could hear her moving through the house before she finally entered the living room where I was sitting. "What is this?" she demanded, dropping the documents onto the coffee table. I glanced at them. "You've already read them." Her expression tightened. "For 8 years we've been married, and this is how you handle problems?" I didn't respond immediately. Over the previous months, I had learned the value of silence. People reveal far more when they aren't being interrupted. For nearly an hour she talked. There had been a misunderstanding. Things weren't what they appeared. Someone was feeding me inaccurate information. The company was full of rumors. Employees complained whenever they didn't get their way. Every explanation arrived neatly packaged and ready to accept. Months earlier, I probably would have accepted them. Now I simply listened. Eventually she stopped speaking. The room became quiet. Then I opened a folder resting beside my chair. I slid several documents across the table. Travel records, conference schedules, hotel reservations, project reassignment reports, internal communications discussing Ethan's continued placement on key initiatives. Lauren looked down. For the first time that evening, she stopped talking. I wasn't interested in dramatic confrontations. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I wanted her to understand that I had already moved beyond questions. The facts were sitting directly in front of her. She flipped through the pages slowly. The confidence she'd entered with disappeared one document at a time. Finally, she set everything down. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she looked at me. Not angry, not defensive, just quiet. And in that moment, I knew something important. She had finally realized that explanations were no longer enough. Because explanations only work when uncertainty still exists. And mine was gone. After that conversation, events unfolded without much involvement from me. For months, I had been gathering information because I wanted clarity. Now the situation had moved beyond my control. Within weeks, Lauren's company initiated an internal review. I wasn't contacted at first. I wasn't asked to participate. The process began because concerns that had been quietly ignored for months were suddenly receiving attention. Former employees started speaking with investigators. Current managers were interviewed. Human resources reopened complaints that had previously gone nowhere. The review appeared limited in the beginning. Questions centered around workplace favoritism, project assignments, and promotion decisions. Then the scope expanded. Additional records were requested. Travel expenses were examined. Communication logs were reviewed. People who had remained silent before became willing to talk. Once that happened, the process gained momentum. What struck me most was how many individuals had their own pieces of the story. One person knew about unusual staffing decisions. Another remembered complaints that disappeared. Someone else recalled projects being reassigned with little explanation. No single person seemed to possess the complete picture. But collectively, they described something larger than simple office politics. Meanwhile, Lauren and I communicated mostly through attorneys. The marriage was ending, and there was very little left to discuss. Occasionally, she attempted to convince me that the investigation would ultimately clear everything up. Maybe she believed that. Maybe she needed to believe it. I never argued. The outcome was no longer my responsibility. For months, I had carried the burden of trying to understand what was happening. Now other people were asking the same questions. Professionals with access to records I would never see. Managers with authority I would never have. I simply watched from a distance. Not because I enjoyed it, because there was nothing else to do. The truth had reached a point where it no longer depended on me to keep moving forward. By the time everything was finished, nearly a year had passed since the afternoon I opened Lauren's tablet. The divorce was finalized without drama. There were negotiations, paperwork, and countless conversations between attorneys, but very little direct communication between us. In some ways, that made the process easier. The emotional arguments had ended long before the legal process concluded. Lauren no longer worked for the company. The internal review eventually resulted in several leadership changes, though most details remained confidential. Publicly, very little was said. Privately, enough people understood what had happened. Ethan Brooks resigned before the investigation reached its conclusion. Whether that decision was voluntary or encouraged, I never learned. And honestly, it stopped mattering. For a long time, I thought reaching the end would feel satisfying. I imagined some sense of victory, some feeling that justice had been served. Instead, what I felt was relief. The uncertainty was gone. For months, questions had occupied every quiet moment of my day. Questions about my marriage. Questions about Lauren. Questions about decisions being made behind closed doors. Eventually, every answer arrived. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic revelation. Just gradually. One fact after another. One document after another. One conversation after another. Until there were no important questions left. The children adjusted better than I expected. Life settled into new routines. Different routines, certainly, but stable ones. Looking back, I don't think the hardest part was discovering the truth. The hardest part was living in uncertainty before the truth became clear. Because uncertainty creates endless possibilities. Reality only creates one. And once reality finally revealed itself, difficult as it was, I could begin moving forward. Not because everything was fixed, because I finally knew where I was standing. And after months of confusion, that certainty was enough. Today, when I think about everything that happened, I rarely focus on the divorce itself. I don't think about the legal documents. I don't think about the investigation. I don't even think much about Ethan Brooks. Instead, I think about a single message that appeared on a tablet screen one ordinary afternoon. Don't worry. Nobody suspects anything. At the time, those words felt confusing. Looking back, they were simply the first piece of a much larger picture. The truth didn't arrive in one dramatic moment. It arrived gradually. A conversation that didn't make sense. A travel record that didn't match a schedule. A complaint that quietly disappeared. A pattern that became impossible to ignore. For months, I had been looking at individual details without seeing how they connected. Once I stepped back and viewed the entire picture, everything changed. The most important lesson wasn't about betrayal. It wasn't about marriage. It wasn't even about workplace misconduct. It was about honesty with myself. The moment I stopped inventing explanations for things that clearly didn't fit, the truth became visible. Not easier, not less painful, just visible. And once I could see it clearly, there was no reason to look away.
That's the end of the story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos for you, so pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.